Hi everybody, welcome to Workshop 6, which as you can see is about the pointy end of power. That's to say when push comes to shove and when people resort to violence. So it's the sort of workshop on the limits of talk in some ways and the ways in which people can step back from crossing that line. Now, war and the outbreak of physical violent actions is probably as old as human society itself. War and everything that goes with it, the killings, destruction of property, abductions, atrocities and suffering and so on, represents the kind of failure of negotiated power positions in favour of utilising physical force and weapons to prosecute your case, prosecute your claims, your grievances, your aspirations or memory of old enmities, whatever they may have been, that may have died down over the years into a sort of tentative, peaceful process, but are prone to flaring up. And this happens in a lot of places around the world. So I'm just going to start this little brief introduction to our workshop with three images of war. The first one's dated April the 24th, 1184 BCE, before the Christian era. And it's an imaginative painting depicting the fall and defeat of the city of Troy, which exists now in contemporary Turkey, to the invading Greek armies, thus ending the Trojan War. And this is something that, for those of you interested, Greek historian Homer wrote about the final days of the Trojan War in his epic, the Iliad. The second image is one reflecting on the 1812 when Napoleon's army invaded the Crimea in Russia. And Leo Tolstoy told a big story about that in 1869, which has become a famous, in literature and so on. And the third image, of course, is one of friendship between a Jewish and Palestinian boy, which in some ways, in its sort of mute nature, speaks volumes about the continuing troubles, the endemic, entrenched troubles in Palestine. So let me say something about the nature of war, and I'll be fairly brief here. There are as many definitions of war, I would say, and warfare, as there are of power. On one hand, you can have a declared war, such as when Britain and France declared war on Germany in the Second World War. So it's an official statement on the part of the leader of the country that we are at war. But there are many more kinds of undeclared wars and violent engagements, which are classified with all sorts of other types of words, euphemistic words really. For example, people talked about the police action in South Korea in 1950, which was the Korean War, or became so, or the Malaysian insurgency, an emergency in the 1950s. And then there are many other armed conflicts that amounted to war but are not officially recognised as such. And we can think of many really. In the US action in Vietnam was never declared a war for a long time. The Vietnamese call it the American War, but America refused to make that claim or make that position clear. The civil war in Sri Lanka, for example, between Tamils and the Sinhalese, a particularly violent and nasty war that continued for many years without really being declared as such. The drug wars in Mexico and Colombia, for example. The ongoing undeclared war, as I mentioned, between Israel and Palestine. And the continuing war, for example, in Syria, which is not a war. It's not declared as a war, but there's certainly enough violence and destruction which is continuing to this day. One of the tragic issues about the outbreak of war, of course, is that there are many victims. And the casualties of war are the critical kind of tragic circumstances of war, really. And it's estimated, for example, that a total of about 123 million people have died in all the wars of the 20th century, for example. Huge numbers. And these are broken down into 37 million military or combatant deaths. That's to say people who actually carry guns and use them. 27 million collateral civilian deaths, so people who just got in the way of the fighting. There were 41 million victims of so-called genocide or mass murder, so an intentional destruction of large numbers of the civilian population, and another 18 million victims of what they call non-genocidal famine, which I suppose is a consequence of the breakdown of supply lines, the failure of agriculture, the destruction of agricultural lands and so on, so that people basically run out of food and die from that lack of food. Based on the evidence of the 21st century wars, these are increasingly played out largely in civilian areas. And so this has been a feature of many of the late 20th century violent civil engagements, where the mistreatment of civilians is part of the strategy of violent force. And we've seen this recently in the Syrian fighting, where the civilian population was kind of like a shield, or used as a shield by ISIS, so they could hide within the civilian populations. Rape and torture has also been, I would say, a traditional weapon of war, and it continues to be used as a way of terrorising people to submit to the warring parties, one or the other. Okay, but there's also other kinds of violence, I suppose, which are taken against minority groups that are not so much an act of war, but an act of this idea of changing the nature of the politics of a place. Communal violence and ethnic cleansing is one such concept. Ethnic cleansing is an extreme form of violent action against a minority or opposition group who are regarded as the source of problems or moral corruption or threat against the integrity of a particular majority population. The phrase ethnic cleansing came into wide usage in the 1990s to describe the treatment suffered by particular ethnic groups during conflicts that erupted after the disintegration of the former Yugoslavia. So the Serbs and Bosnian Serbs attacked Bosnian Muslims. Bosnian territory was systematically cleansed, in that word, by removing all Bosnian Serbs. But versions of ethnic cleansing have been common throughout history and continue to be perpetrated. And I'll just give you some examples of those. Very often, very commonly, they've been used against Jewish populations. But here's a list of ethnic cleansing episodes from early history to very recent times. And I'll let you read these. Battle of Carthage. Edward I of England expelled all the Jews with prejudice. So they were told to leave and they were killed if they didn't in 1290. And this is known as the St. Brice's Day Massacre. There was another St. Brice's Day Massacre, which was a mass execution of Danish people in England in 1002. And this was supposedly undertaken on the orders of King Ethelred the Unready, apparently. But you see here that a series of occasions when the Jews have been forcibly expelled from territories. It seems to be an unfortunate aspect of their history. More recently, we recall the mass murder of Cambodians by the Cambodian Pol Pot regime itself in a kind of ideological madness to reset the nature of Cambodian society. And most recently, I suppose, in 2017, where the world was shocked to see the intimidation and murder of Rohingya Burmese, Rohingya Muslims who were forcibly pushed out of the territory which they'd occupied for hundreds of years, it seems. So ethnic cleansing is not new. It's a factor of the breakdown of clearly relations between groups, and it's an aspect of the exercise of forcible power, I suppose. Power in this case at the end of a gun. I've got here some links to YouTube which illustrate some examples of communal violence and highly destructive to civilian populations. I'm hoping you might copy and paste these and look at these two examples which we will discuss in the workshop. The first of them shows the brutal sectarian violence that erupted between Muslims and Christians in eastern Indonesia in the province of Maluku back around 2002, which had an extremely divisive effect on society which had lived together for hundreds of years, more or less peaceably, between Muslims and Christians. But that all came to an end then, for reasons which you'll see in the film. The second short video is an example of violent action taken by Hindu nationalists in India against Muslims, against Indian Muslims. And it's a particularly shocking video in some ways to see the lengths at which people go to delegitimate, I suppose, fellow citizens. Now, okay, so those images give you a pretty strong sense of the ugly nature of violence and the very destructive nature of violence, in which leave people devastated and often with lingering injuries, a lot of trauma psychologically and so on. But let's move from that situation, which can often continue for some time in any particular violent conflict, but eventually people lose heart for the battle, I suppose. Eventually people seek ways to resolve the violence, to end the kind of slaughter and so on, and find ways to make peace. And I want to move and just say a few things about the whole process of peacemaking and peacekeeping, using a quote from former President of the US, Abraham Lincoln, that the ballot is stronger than the bullet. In many cases it is, but often people resort to the bullet because it's kind of a faster way to solve their problems. So usually and eventually the energy for war is exhausted and the protagonists search for a compromise to put an end to death and suffering. The process can be long because of the large store of grievances, anger, feelings of revenge, retribution for past atrocities makes people reluctant to find agreement. Most important quality of peacemaking, is forgiveness. Finding ways to forgive your enemy is the first steps towards lasting peace. And these images here give you two kind of examples of a sort of public affirmation of peacemaking. The first shows a young Prince Charles here smoking a peace pipe with Native American Indians, specifically Blackfoot tribesmen. So he was showing a way of, through this cultural means of demonstrating your peaceful intentions by sharing a pipe. He's doing that in this case. The second one is Myanmar government negotiators shaking hands with representatives of rebellious ethnic minority states, including Shan, Karen, Chin, Kachin, Mon, and many others, though not prominently here, not with the Rohingyas, but almost everyone else was included, who are regarded as Burmese minority groups. And so the shaking of hands here is a very public symbol of accord, of agreement, of friendship, of which we're all, well aware of these days, even if we're now being encouraged not to do so, but not because of war, but because of the coronavirus. So peacemaking is one thing, peacekeeping is another, and I just want to say something about that. Peacekeeping we're also familiar with as a way of trying to insert some kind of neutral policing function within the context of a violent internal war or feud or insurgency, or rebellion, whatever. And this has been common, I'd say, for the last 50 years. It's a common sight to see these blue-hatted UN peacekeepers operating in different areas of trouble. And often this comes about when when the warring factions reach a point of stalemate, or reach a point where everyone's exhausted from the fighting and there doesn't seem to be a way forward. It's at that point in the conflict when often the main protagonists or people involved in the war agree to quit fighting temporarily or make a temporary stalemate, for example, or a temporary ceasefire, and then engage in some kind of political negotiation. At this point, the peacemakers could come in, the peacekeepers, could be brought in, a neutral force, neutral and recognised on both sides as a neutral operating force to keep the peace. So the reasons why people might do that, the reasons why warring factions might do that, might bring in some kind of independent group, is that they might lack they have a lack of trust in any kind of local operation because of the different allegiances that might apply. They turn to the UN because it's seen as impartial and they can negotiate across the warring divide. It's also often seen as a sign of goodwill on the part of the combatants that they're ready and willing to seek a peaceful solution. Now, when they do implement a UN-based peacekeeping operation, the UN requires the following rules. It has to have the consent of both parties. It has to be seen as impartial, and there's no use of force except in self-defence or the defence of the mandate being to keep the peace in a particular defined context. So this is what is required by the parties to a political process. And here we can see a whole range of different UN peacekeeping operations that have been declared and organised and carried out over the last few decades, let's say. You can see that they're all in highly prominent hotspots, I suppose, around the world, particularly in Africa, particularly in the Middle East. And I've also got an image here of this idea that of a report that came out of 15 UN peacekeepers were killed and more than 50 wounded after the rebels attacked the mission in Congo. So that's not an uncommon event in UN peacekeeping operations, because while the leaders of particularly warring factions might agree on the intervention of the UN in a peacekeeping operation, they don't always have control over all of their subordinate groups, and for whatever reason, the UN peacekeepers can be attacked and killed, perhaps as a sign of defiance, as a sign of unhappiness with the process of negotiations or whatever. Lots of different reasons. So it's not exactly, even though UN tries hard to be impartial, it's not always the case that the people on the ground recognise that. But I should also say that UN peacekeeping activities can be successful. And there's this interesting sort of summary account of peacekeeping and a peacekeeping operation that occurred in the Côte d'Ivoire, the Ivory Coast in Africa, when the UN Security Council authorised this because of a lack of state authority. So they've been embroiled in a civil war for years, a very messy and ugly civil war, and there was no effective state authority to call a halt to that. So the UN decided it would act itself and try and re-establish some kind of operating state institution and government. And this is, over 10 years, this is the success they had. They deployed large numbers of peacekeepers, increasing them to up to nearly 12,000 people in 2011. They had these legislative and presidential elections, and they got the opposition to participate. They strengthened different institutions there. They disarmed the combatants, and they got 250,000 refugees to return by 2016. So there was a tremendous amount of work done and an extraordinary success achieved in this particular operation. Later, once they'd reached those different sort of made that sort of success, they supported, you see their social cohesion project through 1,000 quick impact projects. So these are projects which basically put money into the community so they can do things, so that there's cash being put about and people can, afford to purchase goods and so on. So it re-establishes a sort of normality over time. And this has been... So in some cases then the UN operations are very successful. And for that reason, I guess, they're still seen as being a legitimate and effective way of putting to an end particularly violent clashes. We've seen in Syria and Iraq and so on that hasn't been possible, I guess because of the different power blocks or different armies and politics involved in that process. But in other areas on a smaller scale, they seem to have had some impact. Now, let me just finish off with another kind of aspect of the whole process of war and violence, war and peacemaking. And this is the idea of when often what happens around the world, when the civil war or when the communal violence has ended, when peace has been restored, when people have gone back to a more peaceful civilian life, some countries implement what's called a truth and reconciliation process. They institute some kind of commission or some kind of authority to find out what happened during that period of upheaval and to sort out who should be prosecuted for crimes they've committed, who should be recognised for the good work they've done, and to sort of a process which clears the air, as it were, so that people can tell their stories about what happened to them, and this can be recorded and recognised officially in some sort of state document. Often, Truth and Reconciliation Commissions are tasked with discovering and revealing past wrongdoing by government forces or non-state actors in the hope of resolving conflict left over from the past. So these commissions have two kinds of functions, as I say here. There's a truth-seeking function, focused on the past, investigates patterns of events over a period of time. It engages directly and broadly with affected populations, gathering information on their experiences, and that can often mean small groups of people moving around the country and recording testimony from people who've suffered against or been traumatised, been terrorised by different groups, and they have a story to tell, and they are allowed a forum, and these stories are recorded and kept in large archives. But they also have also, I keep going with the nature of these truth-seeking functions. Once they've done those recordings, these are gathered into large documents, and in most cases, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is then closed or is then finalised because it's only ever meant to be a temporary exercise. It's not an ongoing investigation. It also has to be officially authorised. So these kinds of things have to have strong bipartisan support in order to be effective. You know, if one side feels that they're not getting a fair hearing in this process, then they'll object or resist or whatever. The second aspect of Truth and Reconciliation Councils is to do with reconciliation. So they seek to achieve reparative or restorative justice rather than retribution. In most cases, they're not seeking to prosecute offenders, although this can sometimes occur in cases of so-called serious crimes, murder, mass murder, other kinds of events which are seen, which are considered to need some sort of retributive action. They're charged, there's a court case, and they're jailed, for example. But in most cases, they're seeking some kind of restorative or it's called reparative resolution. And very often this is achieved through community-based systems of justice, some kind of confession on the part of the perpetrator and some absolution or forgiveness on the part of the communities who've suffered from their action and so on. And it can be, and it takes different forms in different countries because of the sort of cultural expectations and practices that occur there. Very often what's held out to offenders in this process is that they will be given future immunity, so they won't be prosecuted for their crimes, which is why they tend to bracket these things into serious crimes and crimes perpetrated in the course of the violent conflict and so on, which aren't as severe. And these have been, I would say these have been very effective. There's been a lot of them, these truth and reconciliation processes from South Africa to Canada. India's had them. Many countries have had them. But one of the ones I thought we could have a quick look at in the workshop is in relation to the truth and reconciliation process that was undertaken in East Timor following the end of Indonesian occupation in 1999. They had a truth and reconciliation process which very much reflected the kind of operations and aspirations of other similar types of commissions. And what it illustrates, I guess, in some ways, is to think about pros and cons of these processes. To what extent do they promote healing? To what extent do they do much good? It does allow people to have a forum where they can talk about their experiences and say what happened to them, so they're kind of acknowledged in that way. And there's often a kind of cathartic healing process that's available when you can unburden yourself from the story from the terrible things that happened to you. When you can tell others what happened, this can often have good effects on your own psyche and sense of well-being and so on. So anyway, we will get back to this issue when we convene in the workshop 6, in due course, and I look forward to seeing you there.